Good morning, brothers and sisters. Good morning, the President. We are meeting here this morning for the first time, and I would like that we recite a universal prayer before we begin. Shall we be ready for it? Shall we stand up? O hidden life, vibrant in every atom, O hidden light, shining in every creature, O hidden love, embracing all in oneness, may each who feels himself as one with Thee know he is therefore one with everybody. Thank you. Please be seated. Yes, we are here again to continue our program for the convention. And this morning, we're going to have two short talks. And I'm so privileged to be made the chairman for this short lectures. Because these people who are here are really eminent personalities. First to begin with would be Mrs. Dunningham Chapotin, who is just immediate international secretary, immediate past international secretary of the Theosophical Order of Service. She has been a member of the TS in New Zealand for nearly 50 years and is a life member of the TS in America, where she worked for 9 years at the Cotonou School of Theosophy in California. Diana now lives in France with her husband, Michel Chapotin, who coordinates the work of the Theosophical Order of Service in France. I was just hinted this morning that Diana has a lot of sense of humor, and I believe that she will show this to some of us. Diana, please share.
Thank you, John. Thank you, John, and good morning, everybody. Last evening, you will remember that Michael Gomes made some announcements before his talk. I have some announcements to make too. The first is that you are welcome, just as you were last night, to take a siesta during my talk, but in exchange for a donation to the work of the Olcott School. Should, on the other hand, your cell phone go off and ring during this talk, or during Professor Tumpi's talk, there will be a fine that will go to the Olcott School. So if you'd be so kind.
I forgot to mention your topic.
I'll mention, shall I mention it? Oh, good. Yes. John forgot to mention my talk title, which is Tuning Into Our World. Thank you. The third announcement is that the theme for this convention, Theosophy in Our Changing World, has just been changed. The theme is now Theosophy in Our Morbidly, Radically Changing World. Now, I say this because human beings have now become a geological force on the planet. Poisoning of the environment has now become systemic. By tampering with the delicate force of nature, the planet has been set on a trajectory toward desolation. Now, when I became International Secretary of the Theosophical Order of Service many, many years ago, people sometimes asked me, even then, if I felt overwhelmed by the state of the world, the violence, the overpopulation, the urbanization, and so on, industrial farming and what have you. Some members even asked if I thought we had gone past the point of no return. And I found this question to be quite understandable and reasonable. This morning, I would like to talk to you about some very simple advice that I received that helped me in my participation in the TOS's endeavours to shape the change in our world in positive, constructive, spiritually oriented ways to help reverse the destructive trend. When I first took up the TOS work at international level, I was full of energy and zeal. When you're a relatively young theosophist and you see exploitation and abuse around you, you want to get out and push the world in the right direction in the light of theosophy. You figure that it should take about a year and a half to straighten out the worst of the problems and maybe 5 or 6 to clean up the rest. The very first thing I did was to start telling my fellow members of the Theosophical Order of Service what we all needed to be doing. Let's do this, let's do that, I'll do this, why don't you do that, and so on. My arms were frantically waving in all directions. I was instantly in a state of what President Tim would call busyness, B-U-S-Y-N-E-S-S. In my state of busyness, all those years ago, there wasn't much response from my fellow members to what I was saying we should be doing. I was wanting to dynamize the work of the TOS and mold the change in the world. But the members remained quite uncommunicative. Now, if the organizing secretary is not managing to inspire the members to participate, something is wrong. I mean, the whole reason for the existence of the TOS is to help theosophists in their service as spiritual practice. Is that not so? The TOS is not meant as a distraction from the main work of spreading the teachings of theosophy, but to help spread these teachings by showing the light they shed on issues of social concern, on the practical problems of human beings. And if the members aren't responding, then something's wrong. I mentioned this unresponsiveness to Vicente Hao Chin, the member from the Philippines who was teaching at the School of the Wisdom a couple of weeks ago and who's coming back tomorrow to give a talk soon. This is what he said to me. Try just listening to the members, Diana. Just listen to them. Now, there may not seem anything revolutionary in that reply of Vic's to me, but surprisingly, good things started to happen when I simply started to listen. Almost immediately, I discovered the amazing hidden talents of my fellow theosophists. I had always thought we were a pretty intellectual bunch, cloistered away in the library and offices and lecture rooms of our TS branches and headquarters buildings, priding ourselves on doing superior spiritual work. I discovered that most members were in fact actually engaged in all kinds of service in the community as part of their spiritual practice. I learned that the TS has not just a distinguished past in terms of service work, but a distinguished present. Whether you know it or not, there are members out there injecting theosophical ideas into children's education, into civic decision-making, into conflict resolution sessions in war-torn zones of the world. Our new International Secretary, Nancy Seacrest, will be telling us about such work in her talk here tomorrow afternoon. And her fellow speakers, Dr. Deepa Padi from Odisha State and Mrs. Usha Shah from Nairobi, Kenya, are two of our most dynamic workers around the world, and they'll be speaking with Nancy tomorrow. Vic Hao Chin's advice to just listen taught me that instead of telling the members what they should be doing, the TOS simply needed to listen to their concerns, all about the planet or about human beings, and to help transform them into practical projects and campaigns in areas they felt passionately about. In recognizing and nurturing their service work, instead of telling them what to do, things became less stressful for me, more joyful for them, and more productive in getting theosophy into our changing world. our radically, morbidly changing world. But there were other kinds of listening that Vic encouraged me to try. There was not just listening to my fellow members, but listening through the heart to human beings in distress. In France, where I live, there are homeless people begging on the streets, including quite a few alcoholics. I learned that it wasn't enough just to look them in the eye, smile, and acknowledge their existence. It was also necessary to open up to the pain of their craving, to the pain of their chapped and chilblained hands, and to the pain of their utter isolation. An awareness of that pain needed to be allowed right into the heart. Listening from the heart to the pain of those in distress spontaneously causes the mind to seek answers. It breaks down barriers of preconception and prejudice. It leads us to explore the social, economic, and political causes of misery. It reveals the complexity and interrelatedness of the issues affecting our planet. We learn to see media reports for what they most often are: superficial accounts written rapidly with an eye to set the astral body quivering and push up viewer ratings. We learn to see through the blatantly unworkable solutions politicians often propose. We are drawn to public forums and associations where social workers, medical personnel, and others acting at grassroots level can indicate the only measures that have a hope of resolving complex problems over the long run. When we really tune in, we are drawn to those at the cold face of social reform, to those in the front line of action to protect the environment. We discover even activist sages who show by who they are the indissoluble link between individual and social transformation. Broadening and deepening our listening allows us to get a more accurate sense of the state of our changing world and to fine-tune the projects we develop for long-term change. I mentioned just a minute ago the way the media influence us and manipulate us, how they constantly stimulate the prurient side of our natures in order to capture our attention and push up their viewer or reader ratings. Now take all the media reports of terrorist acts. In the United States, the fear of terrorism, as projected by the media, has caused 6 times more deaths than terrorism itself. In the past 13 years, 30 American citizens have died through actual terrorist acts. Now that's an awful lot, but 1,500 American citizens have died in road accidents because they've chosen to drive from one city to another out of fear of a terrorist attack on an aeroplane. Because the media bring almost constantly instant news into our living room of the acts of great violence committed on the other side of the globe, we have the impression that the world is an increasingly dangerous place to live. In fact, individual and collective violence has been steadily declining over the past 1,000 years. The number of wars and the number of deaths through war all over the world has been going down for many centuries, proportionate to the number of people on Earth. Now, we need to be careful of statistics and statistics from secondary sources like these, but it can reliably be said that today's citizens are far less at risk of being killed or subjected to violence than a century ago, and far, far less at risk than 1,000 years ago. The media don't often mention the really positive things happening. The number of charitable groups within the United States has doubled since the year 2000, bringing the total to close to 1 million. Isn't that wonderful? The number of charitable groups in the United States has increased astronomically. There are around 40,000 international non-governmental organizations in the world and a vastly greater number of national ones. In Russia, there are around 280,000 non-governmental organizations. India has more than 3 million, and most of these are humanitarian organizations. Again, it's hard to keep up-to-date figures on all this, but it is clear that there is a real tremendous growth in citizenly concern and involvement in reversing the direction in which we are headed on this planet. All the petitions that are circulated on the internet, they raise awareness amongst millions if they do nothing else. But many of them do achieve even more than that when backed up with real-world action. The non-profit organization, Adyar, some of you will have seen that on the internet, organizes successful global media and lobbying efforts around its online petitions and has achieved real things as a result of that. To return to Vic Hao Chin, whom I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, Vic set me thinking about yet another kind of listening that it is important to engage in if we want to make a difference in our world, and that is listening to ourselves. And listening to ourselves is probably the hardest task of all. To be an effective server in this changing world, we have to train ourselves to look squarely at our emotions, our resistances and compulsions. We need to own up to quite natural and understandable feelings of anxiety, indignation, discomfort, nervous fatigue, impatience, disappointment, and so on. Once we have acknowledged this impatience and disappointment and stress, it's easy to fall into the trap of simply preaching at ourselves, simply moralizing ourselves. I must be more patient, I must be less stressed, I must be kinder, and so on. I sometimes think that preaching and moralizing at ourselves is actually counterproductive. I think it just makes us feel guilty, especially women. I think that preaching and moralizing ourselves gives rise to a sense of unworthiness. I think that there is really something below, something beneath our, what I call symptomatic emotions like anger and despair and impatience and irritability. And I think that that something deeper is subconscious fear, and that that fear saps our energy for constructive action. In looking behind or deeper our emotions, looking behind our emotions or deeper, at the deeper level, when we're engaged in service, we can find fear of loss of control, of powerlessness, of vulnerability. We can find a fear of being overwhelmed, of having our heart broken. And ultimately, we can find the fear of extinction. By listening at this level, by becoming aware of the fears, energy can flow more freely for protecting the planet as the precious theatre of evolution it is. Listening to our deepest fears is spiritual work. Now I'd like to look well, not deeply, but just to look a little bit more closely at one or two of these subconscious fears that can block or undermine our energy for constructive service work. What about fear of loss of control? I'd like to share a small example from my own life. Back in the 1990s, when France was still conducting underground tests in the South Pacific at Mururoa Atoll, I joined the campaign to stop the tests. I joined the Greenpeace campaign to convince President Jacques Chirac to stop these tests. You know, I wrote to politicians and I handed out hundreds and hundreds of tracts in the streets of Paris, and I marched on I don't know how many demonstrations, both in Paris and in the provinces. And I came to the point over the weeks where I convinced myself that we were going to win and that Jakshi Rat was not going to do the tests. I just came to this conviction that the tests were not going to go off. And then one afternoon, I heard on the radio, out of the blue, that the first test had gone off. And I was rooted to the spot. I felt my cheeks go red, and my heart started to beat. And I found myself looking down from above on myself because this terrible rage just filled me. And I'd never experienced rage before. It was a terrible shock. It was a terrible shock. And the shock was so great to see me, this Theosophist, feeling rage, that I had to just stop there, still in my tracks, and look within and look at myself, what was going on. And I couldn't just say, oh, well, this is righteous indignation. I had to look more deeply within. And what I discovered was that the fear, it was a terrible fear to discover that there was a world I couldn't control, that there was wickedness around that I could not master. Now, you might think, well, that's a pretty obvious thing to discover, but to me it wasn't. It was a revelation. When I recognized that fear, strangely enough, once I looked at it in the face, my thought spontaneously flew to the tremendous powerlessness other people must feel when, say, a reckless driver kills their child, or when their beloved is suddenly afflicted with a life-threatening illness, or when a person becomes elderly and becomes vulnerable to this feeling of, well, I'm dependent on others, and maybe some unkind others, and you do feel a little powerless in that circumstance. And when I thought of others, when this came to me spontaneously, the rage in me just receded like a wave on the shore, and what flowed back quietly in its place was a feeling of compassion. I realized then what a very sheltered life I had lived in New Zealand with kind parents and so on. And I realized then how greatly, how immensely other people need and deserve our help. There are quite a few frightening things lurking below the surface of our serving selves. There are quite a few frightening things like this lurking below the surface of our serving selves. When we are engaged in service to relieve suffering, the fear of heartbreak, of being overwhelmed by the sadness around us, drowned by the sadness, can come to the surface. That can undermine our energy and our availability. It may mean that we are like oysters that open up on a Monday and Thursday afternoon to do our little service, and then we slap shut. We come home and we close the door behind us and we say, woof, and we put our slippers on. It may mean that when we're out on the street, we avoid the gaze of beggars. It may mean that it may take the form of our shying away from photos of animal abuse, saying to ourselves, well, I'm a vegetarian, I don't need to see those photos. You know, I've done my bit. There are thousands of people out there who need our care and attention, millions of animals being mistreated, forests being laid waste. And all of that can be overwhelming to us. And deep down, a little voice can be whimpering, well, if I answer all these calls, how will I cope? And who's going to look after little me? Who's going to take care of me? What time is there going to be left for me? Subconsciously, that can be going on in us. And the pressure that members of the TOS and members of the TS and all who are in caring professions put on themselves is to feel sometimes that they have to answer all calls for help. And that can be quite threatening to the existence of the self. Now, we can't get rid of all our subconscious fears by a wave of the wand. We will continue, of course, to have our energy undermined by the fear of being submerged by the immensity of the task and the sorrow of it all. We may continue to have our energy sapped by a sense of impotence in the face of outrageous injustice, such as Jacques Chirac letting off more bombs in the Pacific, as far away from France as he could possibly get. We may continue to run from the inner void. But I have the impression that each time we recognize subconscious fears and stare them in the face just for a second, a measure of the spiritual energy running underground in us is released. I'm very grateful to Vicente Hauchin, for suggesting that in trying to bring theosophy to a changing world, in trying to live our theosophy in a changing world, one step we can take is simply to listen. To listen to our fellow members in their giving dharma, and to listen to all of those who are in pain and in distress. We can tune in to the complex psychological, social and economic factors involved in tragic situations and social issues. We can listen, as I said, to the wise activists, the sage activists in the forefront of reform. And finally, as I've just been saying, we can listen to our own deepest fears. This attentiveness, this tuning in at different levels, helps us to get a sense of the real state of the world. Remember, I said it alerts us to the truly good things going on the planet. It alerts us to the greatly increasing number of citizens rallying to the defense of the planet, in spite of what the media tell us. Simply listening shows us the way. Quite a number of people in the Theosophical Society believe that if each of us takes care of our own spiritual transformation, that planetary transformation will take care of itself. I believe that the two go hand in hand. Theosophy is a dynamic force for both individual and social transformation. I have an Irish friend who has a laminated note pinned to her front door, and this is what it says: "If I'm not home accepting what I can't change, I'm probably out changing what I can't accept." Theosophy speaks of limitless inner resources that we can tap into to help shape the future intelligently and even rapidly. It's too late to be pessimistic about our changing world. We need simply to join hands and walk gently on the earth together, listening intently. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Diana. From her talk, I think you can feel the amount of energy she has put in her work as a service for humanity under the umbrella of Theosophical Society. Luckily enough, we have a replacement. Nancy, I'm sure she's going to carry